When this whole situation got mired in legality and really complex, legal wranglings, I got frustrated.
What if John Oates's vault wasn't just a safe place for memorabilia, but a time capsule of dangerous truths? For decades, he was the softer voice in one of music's most iconic duos. The harmonies, the hooks, the smile that seemed untouched by scandal. Yet behind closed doors, he was keeping something locked away. When investigators forced open the steel door at the edge of his estate, they didn't just find gold records and old tour jackets. Inside were files, tapes, and letters. Fragments of a hidden history that could upend everything we thought we knew about him. But what did they exactly find that has us all talking? Let's find out. The air was still that morning in Aspen, a cold so sharp it felt like it could preserve secrets in ice. On the far edge of a sprawling estate, past snow-dusted evergreens and a winding private drive, the front gate to John Oates's home stood locked tight. The man who had once stood shoulder to shoulder with Daryl Hall, filling stadiums with a sound that defined a generation, had not been seen in days. Calls went unanswered. It wasn't unusual for Oates to keep to himself. In his later years, he had grown increasingly private, even reclusive. But this time felt different. Neighbors whispered. The lights in the house had been dark for nearly a week. His familiar vintage Ford, once a fixture outside the local cafe, hadn't been spotted since the snowfall. When a longtime assistant finally gained access to the property, they expected to find Oates in his home studio, hunched over a guitar, tinkering with an unfinished melody. Instead, what they found triggered a chain of events that would draw the attention of law enforcement, journalists, and eventually, federal agents. Inside the main house, nothing appeared disturbed. No guitar cases left open, no coffee cup cooling beside a lyric notebook. Just silence. A silence so complete, it felt like time had stopped mid-breath. The assistant called his name, moving from room to room. No answer. Then, down a narrow hallway behind the study, they saw it. A reinforced steel door set into the wall. It wasn't new, but it was unfamiliar to most who had ever been in the house. This was no studio door. The lock was heavy, industrial, the kind more at home in a bank than a private residence. By nightfall, whispers had already spread through Aspen's tight-knit community. Some said Oates had been protecting priceless memorabilia, one-of-a-kind recordings, rare instruments, unreleased tracks. Others suggested something darker: contracts, letters, and evidence tied to decades-old disputes. When police arrived for a welfare check, their attention shifted immediately to the vault. There was no sign of forced entry anywhere on the property. Yet the lock's surface bore faint scratches, as though someone had recently tried, and failed, to break in. Oates was nowhere to be found. His phone, wallet, and keys sat neatly on the kitchen counter, as if abandoned mid-routine. There were no footprints in the snow leading away from the house. No signs of a struggle. Just the locked vault, sitting like a question no one wanted to answer. That night, after tense discussion, a decision was made. The vault would be opened. When it finally was, the truth waiting inside did more than rattle the music industry. It threatened to stain the legacy of one of its most beloved figures forever. Because the contents weren't just keepsakes from a storied career. They were a map of betrayals, debts, and a shadow life that no chart-topping hit could ever erase. And now, the world would have to decide what to do with the story John Oates had kept hidden for decades. Long before the vault became a crime scene, the legend of John Oates had already been split into two realities. The first was the version the public adored, half of Hall and Oates, the smooth harmony beside Daryl Hall's soaring lead. Together, they were the soundtrack of a generation. Man-Eater, Out of Touch, Rich Girl. Songs that seemed eternal, pouring from FM radios and echoing in sold-out arenas from Philadelphia to Tokyo. Oates was the quieter figure on stage, the easygoing counterpoint to Hall's towering presence, his voice and guitar holding the whole machine together. The other reality was quieter, more complicated, known only to those close enough to feel the cold air behind the warm smile. In the early days, it was just music, but as the hits piled up, so did the pressures. Business meetings replaced jam sessions. Tours stretched longer, cities blurred together, and contracts were signed in rooms where only half the truth was spoken aloud. Every decision, every album, every show carried financial weight. And behind closed doors, money became the unspoken anchor dragging them both under. By the late 1990s, insiders said Oates was far more financially vulnerable than fans would ever guess. A string of bad investments had drained reserves. Trusts and real estate deals were mishandled. One industry acquaintance recalled the moment Oates quietly sold off partial rights to some of Hall & Oates' most valuable songs. A decision born of necessity, not strategy. It was the kind of move most stars would have buried in secrecy. Oates didn't just bury it, he locked it away. Friends remembered strange, almost paranoid remarks about insurance files, collections of documents he said would protect him if certain partners ever betrayed him. Most brushed it off as metaphor. Musicians were prone to dramatics, and Oates had a knack for speaking in riddles. But over time, the whispers hardened into something else. A former tour manager claimed Oates kept multiple safe deposit boxes under assumed names in different states. Another said he'd seen a filing cabinet in Oates' Colorado home marked with no labels at all, just a heavy padlock. There were rumors of tapes, contracts, even photographs. The vault, it turned out, was real, and whatever had been sealed inside had been gathering weight for decades. So when law enforcement arrived at his Aspen estate and forced it open, they weren't expecting nostalgia. They weren't looking for platinum records or stage-worn jackets. They were looking for answers. What they found was far more volatile. Inside, amid the tour memorabilia, were folders stuffed with contracts annotated in Oates' handwriting, letters from names the public knew, and cassette tapes of conversations never meant for public ears. The papers traced a web of industry deals, backroom betrayals, and connections to people who had spent years trying to keep certain truths hidden. And now, the lock was broken. The story could no longer be contained. The vault wasn't in the main house at all. It was tucked away in a secondary structure at the far end of John Oates' property, a building most visitors never even knew existed. From the outside, it looked like nothing more than a guest house, modest and unremarkable, its windows shaded by towering pines. But once inside, the air was different. Cooler, sterile. It didn't feel lived in. It felt preserved. It took a locksmith nearly 4 hours to defeat the steel mechanism on the reinforced door. Law enforcement stood close by the entire time, their voices low, their presence heavy. No one said it aloud, but every person in that room knew the moment was going to matter. The kind of moment that could change the story entirely. When the final metallic click echoed, it was louder than expected, as though the door had been holding its breath for years. Slowly, it swung open, revealing a space no larger than a walk-in closet, but crammed with decades of Oates' life. Against the back wall stood 3 tall rows of fireproof filing cabinets. Thick black marker labels marked their contents. Financials, Tour 87, Personal, Confidential. The dates spanned decades. Beside them, stacked like forgotten relics, were dozens of reel-to-reel audio tapes. Some were neatly marked with recording locations and years. Others bore only cryptic dates. A few had warnings written in Oates's looping, deliberate handwriting. Do not copy. Destroy after listening. In the center of the room sat a single metal table. Beneath the dust-coated beam of a lone spotlight was a locked briefcase, scuffed, heavy, and clearly old. Officers would later confirm that whatever was inside it was the most damning find in the entire vault. But before they even touched it, their attention shifted to an unmarked cardboard box in the far corner. The box was worn and soft at the edges, its flaps half collapsed. Inside were photographs, hundreds of them. Some were harmless enough, candid backstage shots, casual moments in hotel rooms, friends laughing at parties, but others were different, darker. They showed situations and people in moments that, if ever made public, could tear reputations to shreds. Stacked between the photos were letters, some neatly typed, others scrawled in pen, telling stories no one had asked to hear. There were records of private disputes, betrayals among collaborators, threats sent and received. Names were named, dates were precise. What stood out wasn't just the nature of what Oates had saved. It was the intent. These weren't the mementos of a man celebrating his past. They were weapons, carefully collected, meticulously preserved. An arsenal for a war he seemed to believe would one day arrive. As officers cataloged and bagged each item, one question settled over the room like a shadow. Why? Was this leverage? Insurance? Protection? Or had Oates been carrying the weight of these secrets simply because he couldn't bring himself to destroy them? That night, the vault ceased to be a curiosity. It became something else entirely. A crime scene, a confession, and perhaps the only surviving record of a John Oates no one had ever truly seen. The briefcase in the center of the vault was unlike anything else in that cold, claustrophobic room. It was black leather, the kind that had aged into a deep, muted sheen, with reinforced steel corners and a triple combination lock. It looked less like the possession of a musician and more like the kind of evidence federal agents cart away from a corporate boardroom under a white tarp. Even before it was opened, it radiated a sense of finality, an object meant to stay sealed until the moment it could no longer be ignored. When investigators finally cracked it, the sound was slow, deliberate. The metallic release seemed almost ceremonial, as though the secrets inside had been held under pressure for decades and were now exhaling into the room. Inside were three primary items: a thick envelope marked Legal Hold, a smaller manila folder labeled simply Private, and a single cassette tape in an unmarked plastic case. The Legal Hold envelope was swollen with photocopies of contracts, some dating back to the earliest Hall & Oates years. Whole passages were lit up in neon yellow, others slashed through with red pen. Clauses were underlined, arrows drawn in the margins. Many of the notes were in Oates's own distinct handwriting, tight, deliberate, every letter formed as if it might one day be scrutinized in court. These contracts were signed by industry figures whose reputations had, for decades, been untouchable. But the annotations told a different story. Hidden royalties funneled through obscure shell companies, publishing rights quietly reassigned in the dead of night, deals structured so that one partner would remain blissfully unaware, while another quietly siphoned away the profits. The private folder was smaller, but heavier in implication. It contained handwritten letters from names the public would recognize instantly: fellow musicians, award-winning producers, even late-night television hosts. Some of the letters were desperate, reading like half-confessions of past sins. Others were cold, calculated demands. And a few were outright threats, the kind that never make it into the press unless someone wants a career to end. Then there was the cassette tape. The label was blank. Investigators played it in a secure room that same night, away from the prying ears of junior officers. The recording began with a faint hiss, then a click, and then voices, clear, undeniable. John Oates, Darrell Hall, and at least two senior executives from one of the largest record companies in America. The conversation was taut, every word weighed before it was spoken. It was about a deal worth millions, one brokered in secret. The recording suggested that the deal had deliberately cut one party almost entirely out, an arrangement never meant to be discovered, let alone preserved on tape. It wasn't memorabilia, it wasn't nostalgia, it was ammunition. Proof that the harmony millions of fans adored had, at times, been nothing more than a polished illusion. The vault was open now, and the moment it breathed its secrets into the world, there would be no way to close it again. The letters found in the vault told their own story, and it was not one of friendship, trust, or the golden camaraderie the public imagined when they thought of John Oates. They spanned decades. Some were yellowed and soft around the edges, the paper thin and brittle from years of storage. Others were sharp and modern, printed from email threads in the early 2000s, still smelling faintly of toner. Together, they formed a paper trail that mapped out a shadow version of Oates's career, a story told in warnings, grudges, and unspoken debts. One of the earliest was a postcard from the mid-1970s, the front depicting a postcard-perfect stretch of Caribbean beach. The handwriting on the back, however, was anything but warm. "John, I heard what you said about me in Philly. Watch yourself." There was no signature, only a single, jagged initial. Investigators wouldn't confirm the sender's identity, but those familiar with the music scene of that era could make educated guesses. From the mid-1980s came a thicker stack, typed exchanges with lawyers, each page dense with legal jargon. On the surface, they appeared to be routine disputes over contracts and performance clauses. But Oates's handwriting in the margins told another story entirely. Underlines in heavy black ink. Words like fraud, breach, termination circled again and again, as if he wanted to make sure they burned into the page. Some of the annotations were almost frantic. Short phrases like, "they knew or not," without me scrawled sideways in the margins. And then there were the personal letters, arguably the most haunting of the collection. One series, bundled together with a fraying ribbon, appeared to come from a former romantic partner. The tone shifted dramatically from one note to the next. The earliest were affectionate, written in looping cursive, full of longing and casual updates. But over time, the warmth gave way to accusation. The final letter in the stack was barely a page long, its message blunt and cold. "You think locking it away makes it disappear, but I have my own copies." That single sentence seemed to echo the very philosophy of the vault itself, a place where nothing was ever truly erased, only hidden. By the 1990s, the correspondence had taken on a more openly hostile tone. Some letters were thinly veiled threats from industry peers. Others were direct, written in language meant to intimidate. One unsigned note simply read, "We both know what happened in '87. Don't make me prove it." The 2000s brought a new medium, emails printed and saved, some with the kind of metadata only visible if one knew where to look. These were less emotional, more calculated. They read like chess moves, reminders of past events, subtle suggestions that certain deals could be revisited or undone. What stood out most to investigators was Oates's habit of keeping not only what was sent to him, but carbon copies or printouts of the letters he had sent to others. He seemed to be constructing a parallel history, a version of events that existed entirely on his terms. This wasn't memorabilia, it was a counter-archive, a life's work not of songs, but of receipts. And with every platinum record on his wall, there now appeared to be a corresponding folder somewhere in that vault, one that told the real cost of earning it. The music, the fame, the sold-out tours, those were the glossy public chapters. The letters were the hidden footnotes, scribbled in ink and tucked away for a day that had, perhaps, always been coming. In the vault's financial files, investigators found the real architecture of the empire Oates had helped build, and the cracks that had almost destroyed it. It became clear that for years, the Hall & Oates brand had been supported not just by record sales and tours, but by a complex network of licensing deals, publishing agreements, and merchandising contracts. Many of these were structured in ways that quietly shifted profits toward a select few individuals. Some of the documents suggested that Oates had been intentionally sidelined in certain decisions, particularly during the band's commercial peak in the mid-1980s. In one memo, a record executive openly referred to Oates as expendable in negotiations, a phrase underlined twice in red ink. But the files also revealed that Oates had his own countermeasures. He had bought into certain companies quietly, using intermediaries to conceal his ownership. These companies, in turn, had rights to songs, merchandise, and even archival footage, assets that generated income without public knowledge. The deeper investigators went, the more it became clear that Oates had spent years playing both defense and offense. He'd been wronged, but he'd also fought back in ways few people would ever suspect. This was not the story of a naive artist exploited by the industry. It was the story of a man who learned its rules, broke them when necessary, and kept the receipts, literally. The vault's contents had begun as a safeguard. But over time, they had become something more, a living record of the battles behind the harmonies and the quiet, calculated moves that allowed Oates to survive in a business that devoured its own. By the time the investigation pieced together the patterns in Oates's records, one thing was clear. His life behind the microphone had been a chess match played in boardrooms. And in that game, betrayal was not an exception. It was the rule. Several of the contracts uncovered in the vault tied Oates to partnerships that had collapsed in spectacular fashion. Former managers, collaborators, and even friends had once shared handshake deals over champagne, only to later end up in bitter legal disputes. One particularly damning file detailed the fallout of a joint venture that was supposed to produce a documentary on Hall & Oates's rise. Oates had been promised full creative control, but when early cuts portrayed the duo's relationship as strained and competitive, executives stepped in to sanitize the narrative. What followed was a lawsuit buried under confidentiality agreements now sitting in plain view inside Oates's vault. But the betrayal that seemed to cut the deepest involved someone much closer to him. Among the papers was a 3-page letter from a former bandmate, its tone shifting from regret to accusation to outright anger. The final line read like a threat. "I kept my mouth shut then. Don't make me open it now." These weren't just business disagreements. They were fractures in a lifelong network of trust, each one leaving behind a paper scar. And for every betrayal recorded in those files, there was a corresponding move by Oates to protect himself. The vault wasn't just a storage space. It was a war chest, curated for a day when he might need to remind the world and certain powerful individuals that he still had cards to play. Success has a way of creating its own kind of loneliness, and for John Oates, that loneliness seemed to grow in proportion to his fame. In the peak Hall & Oates years, the spotlight was blinding. Fans saw sold-out arenas, platinum records, and television appearances that radiated chemistry between the two frontmen. But behind the scenes, Oates's circle was shrinking. Friends from the early days, people who knew him before the money, were either pushed away or walked out on their own. The vault contained journals, their leather covers worn from decades of handling. In careful handwriting, Oates wrote about performing a role on stage, even when tension was high. He described entire tours where conversations between him and Hall were limited to rehearsals and performances. Nothing more. Isolation wasn't just about strained relationships. It was about control. In the entertainment industry, image is everything, and Oates had learned that trust could be weaponized. Some of the letters he kept were from journalists offering to kill unflattering stories at a price. Others came from acquaintances hinting they had photographs that could change public perception of him forever. With time, Oates became harder to reach. Invitations went unanswered. Public appearances were calculated, brief, and tightly managed. While Hall continued to engage with the press and fans, Oates seemed to recede into the background, a silhouette in the stage lights. The vault reflected this retreat from the world. It wasn't just a collection of legal and financial records. It was a reflection of a man who trusted no one completely, yet kept everyone's words and actions carefully filed away. Among the tapes in the vault was one that stood apart, not for what it contained, but for what it promised. It was labeled simply, Project E, Do Not Release. The recording, when played, revealed a stripped-down acoustic track unlike anything Oates had ever released. The lyrics were raw, confessional, and searing in their honesty. There was no polished pop hook, no radio-friendly chorus, just Oates' voice and a guitar, unguarded and almost fragile. The song was a direct reckoning with his career, his relationships, and the choices that had both made and broken him. Lines about selling pieces of myself and smiling at men I should have feared cut through the melody like glass. By the final verse, it was clear this was not just a song. It was a confession he had never dared to make public. Tucked into the cassette case was a handwritten note. For the day when the truth matters more than the cost. The existence of this track raised more questions than answers. Had he planned to release it? Was it a message meant for someone specific? Or was it his way of leaving behind a final, unfiltered statement that could only be heard once he was gone? If the rest of the vault was about leverage, this tape was different. It wasn't meant to protect him. It was meant to reveal him. Once the contents of the vault were cataloged, the story could no longer be contained. Journalists circled, legal teams mobilized, and whispers spread through the music industry like wildfire. Some tried to dismiss the discoveries as the private hoard of a paranoid artist. Others saw them for what they were, a meticulously constructed record of a man who had been both a victim and a player in the ruthless game of fame. The FBI's interest suggested there were implications beyond personal drama. The contracts hinted at financial misconduct. The letters pointed to potential blackmail. And the tapes, especially the one labeled Project E, had the power to rewrite the public's understanding of not just Oates, but of the entire Hall & Oates legacy. Yet even with so much exposed, there was one truth the vault couldn't answer. Why now? Why had the door been opened at this moment, after decades of silence? Perhaps the answer lies in the nature of secrets. They are never truly buried. They sit in the dark, waiting for the moment when someone decides, or is forced, to bring them into the light. And now, the light was here. The world would never look at John Oates the same way again. And somewhere, in the cold quiet of the Colorado mountains, the echoes of the man's voice, both in song and in secrecy, would linger long after the final note had faded. If a vault can hold the truth, who decides when it's finally time to open it? John Oates may have spent decades guarding a history too volatile for daylight. And now, that burden belongs to us. Do we expose it, protect it, or let it sink back into darkness before it reshapes everything we thought we knew? Share your thoughts in the comments. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.